Some experts believe that Japan, which has still not recovered from the bursting of the bubble in the late 1980s, is facing another recession.
We still have a problem of the financial system worldwide.
Japan's economy hasn't really been doing well over the past 2 decades.
Have you ever wondered how a country that once seemed to have built a time machine ended up stuck in a temporal loop? Welcome to Japan, the nation that, back in the 80s, convinced the whole world we were one step away from flying cars and household robots, but that today feels like a living museum of what the future was supposed to be. Picture an economy so powerful it made Americans tremble, companies that revolutionized the way we interact with technology, and a promise of endless prosperity. Now picture that same country still using fax machines in 2025, with a rapidly aging population and young people who'd rather skip sex altogether. What on earth happened? Today, we're diving into the fascinating story of how Japan went from the planet's most futuristic nation to one that seems to be peering at the future through the rearview mirror. It's a journey of explosive economic bubbles, bizarre corporate decisions, and a society that, as sociologist Ulrich Beck would put it, is trapped between reflexive modernity and age-old traditions that refuse to die. If you think your existential crisis is complicated, just wait until you meet the identity crisis of an entire nation. The Japan we know today, with its cutting-edge technology and globally adored pop culture, rose from the literal ashes of World War II. When British historian Arnold Toynbee visited Hiroshima in 1967, he called Japan's rebirth an unprecedented historical miracle. It was hard to disagree. Think about it. A country the size of Montana, virtually devoid of natural resources and devastated by 2 atomic bombs, managed in just 3 decades to become the world's second largest economy. As economist Joseph Stiglitz put it, Japan rewrote the development economics playbook. Between 1950 and 1973, Japan's economy grew at an average annual rate of 10%. To put that in perspective, it's like your salary doubling every 7 years. Impressive, right? Economic historian Angus Maddison dubbed this stretch the golden age of Japanese capitalism. How did they pull it off? Well, when your infrastructure is completely destroyed, you get to rebuild it from scratch with the latest tech. As Nietzsche might say, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Though he probably wasn't thinking of atomic bombs at the time, Japan adopted what Professor Chalmers Johnson called the developmental state model. Government, corporations, and banks formed an almost inseparable triple alliance. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, picked strategic sectors to back. Banks provided cheap capital, and firms poured money into technology and exports. It was capitalism, but capitalism with distinctly Japanese features. As sociologist Ronald Dorr observed in British Factory, Japanese Factory, while the West prioritized shareholders, Japan prioritized employees and long-term growth. The result? Toyota, Sony, Panasonic, Nintendo, Nikon, Canon, brands that became synonyms for quality and innovation. Japan flipped the old "Made in Japan" stigma of the 1950s from a cheap junk to a seal of excellence. As comedian Jay Leno joked back then, remember when "Made in Japan" meant garbage? Now it means you better buy it today because tomorrow it'll cost more. Japanese companies didn't just copy Western products, they improved them. Sony didn't just duplicate American radios, it miniaturized them. Toyota didn't just copy American cars, it made them more efficient. The Toyota production system, spearheaded by Taiichi Ono, revolutionized global manufacturing with concepts like just-in-time and Kaizen, now a favorite buzzword of motivational coaches. Then came the 1980s. Japan looked unstoppable. Filmmaker Ridley Scott imagined a future ruled by Japanese aesthetics and corporations in Blade Runner, 1982. Michael Crichton wrote the thriller Rising Sun, 1992. Later a film with Sean Connery, about Japanese firms about to swallow the US economy. Japanese companies snapped up American icons like Rockefeller Center and Columbia Pictures. As political scientist Chalmers Johnson said, Americans were blindsided by Japan's economic success because they never imagined a non-Western country could beat the West at its own game. At the height of the boom, Tokyo real estate prices skyrocketed so much that the Imperial Palace grounds were theoretically worth more than the entire state of California. A single square meter in Ginza cost the same as an entire Manhattan apartment. The world braced for the Japanese era. But, as we now know, that era never arrived. In December 1989, Tokyo's stock market hit its all-time high. In the weeks that followed, it began to fall and kept falling. What no one realized then was that this wasn't just the end of a boom. It was the start of a collapse that would last for decades. Welcome to Japan's lost decades. Imagine a party where everyone is drunk on optimism, dancing to the beat of increasingly extravagant economic forecasts. Now imagine the collective hangover that followed when the Japanese bubble burst in the early 1990s. The exact turning point in Japan's economy occurred on December 29, 1989, when the Nikkei 225 index on the Tokyo Stock Exchange hit its all-time high of 38,957.44 points. This was literally the last business day of the 1980s, a nearly poetic symbol of the end of a golden era. What few realized was that this spectacular prosperity was built on extremely fragile foundations. Several critical factors were operating behind the scenes. In the days that followed, the market began to decline, and by the end of 1990, the Nikkei had lost about 38% of its value. Simultaneously, the real estate market, absurdly inflated, began to collapse. At the peak of the bubble, the nominal value of the Japanese real estate market was estimated at around 4 quadrillion yen, approximately $20 trillion at the time. 4 times the value of all real estate in the United States, a country 25 times Japan's land size. Japanese banks had become rampant lending machines. As part of the keiretsu system, interlinked business conglomerates, banks lent huge sums to companies with which they had close ties, often without proper risk assessment. What few outside Japan realized was that Japanese banks operated under a system known as the convoy system, where weaker banks were protected by stronger ones under the supervision of the Ministry of Finance. This system created devastating moral hazard. Banks believed they would be bailed out if they got into trouble, encouraging them to take ever greater risks. Professor Richard Koo, chief economist at the Nomura Research Institute, called what happened in Japan a balance sheet recession, a fancy term meaning everyone was so deep in debt that when asset prices fell, the economy went into a tailspin. Between 1990 and 2003, real estate prices in Japan fell by about 80%. To put that into perspective, imagine buying an apartment for $1 million and a decade later, it's worth only $200,000. The Japanese stock market, the Nikkei, plunged from nearly 39,000 points to less than 8,000 at its lowest point. Trillions of dollars in wealth simply vanished. Who would have thought that building an economy on artificially inflated land prices could go wrong, right? It's almost as if there's a historical pattern of economic bubbles bursting or something like that. Economist Paul Krugman described Japan's situation as a liquidity trap, a condition where no matter how much money the central bank pumps into the economy, people prefer to hoard it instead of investing. As the Japanese saying that emerged at the time goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Or in this case, you can offer loans at ultra-low interest rates, but you can't make companies take them when they're already drowning in debt. Japanese companies, instead of declaring bankruptcy, entered a state economists began to call zombie companies, technically alive, but practically dead, dragging themselves through the economy and sucking up resources that could be better used in more productive ventures. The Japanese government tried everything to revive the economy. It slashed interest rates to near zero. It launched stimulus package after stimulus package, building bridges to nowhere and highways that few people use. Japan today has the highest public debt to GDP ratio among developed countries, over 260%. To put that in perspective, Greece collapsed with a debt of only 180% of GDP. As economist Richard Katz put it in his book, Japan, the system that soured, Japan went from an economy that did a lot with a little to one that does little with a lot. But the problem wasn't just economic, it was demographic. While the economy was collapsing, Japan's population was aging rapidly. The birth rate plummeted to one of the lowest in the world. Currently, around 1.3 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed to maintain a stable population. As a result, Japan is literally shrinking. The population peaked in 2010 at 128 million and is projected to fall below 100 million by 2050. Demographer Nicholas Eberstadt called this a population implosion, an unprecedented phenomenon for a country in peacetime. MIT economist Lester Thurow was even more blunt. Japan is in a race to see what happens first, economic recovery or the disappearance of the Japanese people. As if that weren't enough, Japan decided to add a touch of natural catastrophe to the mix. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, followed by the Fukushima nuclear disaster, cost the country around $360 billion, the most expensive natural disaster in modern history. As one Japanese economist bitterly joked at the time, "We have a saying, misfortune never comes alone." But in Japan's case, it seems misfortune brought the whole family and decided to move in permanently. Here lies the great Japanese paradox. How can a country that invented the CD, the DVD, hybrid cars, bullet trains, and humanoid robots seem, in many ways, frozen in time? Let's start with the most visible aspect of this paradox: the Japanese workplace. While the world moved toward digitalization, many Japanese companies held onto an almost fetishistic love for paper. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic forced remote work, many Japanese businesses came to a standstill, not because they lacked technology, but because their processes relied on physical stamps, hanko, on paper documents. As journalist Hiroko Tabuchi wrote in the New York Times, Japan is the place where you find some of the world's most advanced electronics being manufactured in state-of-the-art factories, but where offices still rely heavily on fax machines, CDs, and floppy disks. The Japanese corporate culture, once praised for its efficiency and dedication, has become an example of rigidity and resistance to change. Lifetime employment and seniority-based promotions, once considered strengths of the Japanese system, have become shackles that stifle innovation and mobility. MIT professor Yasheng Huang notes that the Japanese system rewards conformity and punishes divergence, creating what he calls institutionalized risk aversion. This helps explain why Japan, despite all its technological expertise, has not managed to produce disruptive companies like Google, Amazon, or Facebook. Japan even has a term for its unmotivated youth: Satori Seidai, or enlightened generation. Young people who have given up on material aspirations because they realize that no matter how hard they try, the system won't reward them. As sociologist Kumazawa Makoto wrote, "It's a generation that discovered that moderation and being content with little are wiser than the endless pursuit of more." It's almost as if a society that values stability above all else ends up becoming, well, too stable. Who would have thought? But Japan's story is not just one of stagnation. It's also a story of missed opportunities. Take the case of Sony. In the 1980s, the company dominated the portable electronics market with the Walkman. Sony had all the technology necessary to create something like the iPod years before Apple. In fact, it had more. It had the patents, the engineers, the factories, and even the music. Sony owns one of the world's largest record labels. So why was it Apple, not Sony, that revolutionized digital music? Former Sony CEO Howard Stringer gave a revealing answer. Sony is trapped in silos. The hardware divisions don't talk to the software divisions, which don't talk to the entertainment divisions. This is the central paradox, the very system that allowed Japan to grow so rapidly. With its massive interconnected corporations, keiretsu, cooperative banks, and government planning, became an obstacle when the economy needed disruption and reinvention. The Japanese economy was designed for catch-up, not frontier innovation. The system worked beautifully when the goal was to catch up to the West, but failed when Japan needed to lead the way. Demographics also contribute to this paradox. Japan has the oldest population in the world, with nearly 30% of Japanese over the age of 65. As demographic economist David Foote once said, demographics explain 2/3 of everything. An aging population tends to be more risk-averse, less likely to start new businesses, and more focused on preserving what they have than creating something new. Each new generation in Japan is substantially smaller than the one before. This decline isn't accidental, but the result of a combination of social and economic forces. Tiny, expensive apartments in major cities, a work culture that demands near total dedication, a social system that forces women to choose between career and motherhood, and a stagnant economy that leaves young people without the confidence to start families. The refusal to adopt more open immigration policies only worsens the situation, with the country having lost over 3 million people in the past decade. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe tried to reverse this with his Abenomics, a mix of monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, and structural reforms. My mission is to bring Japan back, he said. His efforts did yield some positive results, with unemployment dropping to historic lows, but they failed to address the underlying problems. What Japan's case shows us is that economic systems have expiration dates. What works in one era can become a burden in the next. The very institutional arrangements that were Japan's strength in the industrial era became its weaknesses in the information age. And perhaps the most ironic paradox is this. While Japan struggled with economic stagnation, its global cultural influence only grew. Anime, manga, J-pop, Japanese fashion, Japanese cuisine, all became global phenomena. Japan may have failed to dominate the world economically, but it conquered hearts and minds culturally. Japan became a cultural superpower just as it stopped being an economic one. Japan's recent history is a powerful parable about the dangers of complacency and resistance to change. It's also a warning to other developed economies. Many of the trends that define Japan's stagnation, an aging population, rising inequality, near zero interest rates, companies sitting on mountains of cash yet hesitant to invest, are now visible across much of the developed world. Sociologist Manuel Castells suggested that Japan is not behind the future. It may be showing all of us an aspect of the future. In other words, Japan isn't stuck in the past. It's showing us a possible future, one in which aging societies struggle to sustain economic systems built for a different era. So, what can we learn from Japan's story? First, that adaptability is more important than efficiency. A system that is perfectly efficient under one set of circumstances can become perfectly dysfunctional when those circumstances change. Second, that overly homogeneous corporate cultures can be fatal to innovation. As Steve Jobs once said, creativity is just connecting things, and those connections are more likely to happen in diverse environments. Third, that demography is destiny. No economic policy, no matter how brilliant, can fully compensate for the impact of a shrinking population. And perhaps most importantly, what seems inevitable rarely is. In 1989, it was obvious that Japan would dominate the 21st century economically. In 1999, it was obvious that Japan would never recover. Both views turned out to be wrong. Today, despite all its problems, Japan remains the third largest economy in the world. It is still a leader in robotics, hybrid cars, and several other high-tech sectors. And perhaps more importantly, it continues to reinvent its culture in ways that inspire the world. Japan's challenges are real and profound, but writing the country's economic obituary would be premature. As Japanese author Haruki Murakami once said, "And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure, in fact, whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain, when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in." And speaking of economic crises and seemingly simple solutions, if you enjoyed this video and want to understand another economic mystery that directly affects Japan and nearly every modern economy, check out our previous video on why we can't just print money to pay off the debt. There, we demystify this tempting idea that many people support when they see countries like the US drowning in astronomical debt. Together, we'll discover why this magical solution that seems so obvious could actually open the door to even bigger problems. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming videos. On this channel, we keep decoding the complex world we live in, one video at a time. Thank you for watching.